In the last few years, activism around the globe has produced some pretty viral moments. Climate activists from Just Stop Oil throwing soup at sunflowers in London's National Gallery, for instance. Protesters sitting in the middle of busy roads blocking traffic through rush hour. And activists, of course, like Greta Thunberg, delivering speeches to world leaders and generating viral moments such as the flotilla to Gaza, blowing up all across social media. These protests generate enormous attention. The clips spread everywhere. The media covers them for days. Millions upon millions of people end up seeing them. But they also raise an interesting question, because when people think about activism historically, those images tend to look very different from what we see today. Civil rights protests in the USA being beaten by police, for one example. Environmental activists sailing small boats directly in front of Japanese whaling ships in the Southern Ocean. Or protesters even in my home state of Tasmania being arrested trying to stop the Franklin River Dam project. And that contrast raises a question worth thinking about. Has modern activism in the 21st century shifted from confronting power directly to simply performing outrage just for social media attention? I'm an older millennial, so I'm old enough to remember when environmental activism looked very different. When I was growing up, activists would chain themselves to logging equipment. They would physically block construction projects. And groups like Greenpeace famously put small boats between whales and harpoons. The point of those protests was simple. They were actually trying to stop something from happening by putting themselves directly in harm's way. I'm sure most countries around the world have examples of this, but one particularly close to my heart would be the Franklin River project in Tasmania. This happened in the early 80s, led by Bob Brown, who protested the damming of the Franklin River, one of the last wild rivers left in Australia. Hundreds upon hundreds of protesters were arrested. They lived on the river for weeks at the time, preventing the dam's construction. Now, getting arrested was understood to be part of the protest. If you were physically trying to stop a major infrastructure project, there's going to be consequences. And the activists of those days accepted that. You saw exactly the same thing in the American civil rights movement in the 60s. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. organised marches that directly challenged segregation laws. Events like Selma to Montgomery marches involved enormous personal risk to those involved. People were beaten, jailed, attacked by mobs. But again, these activists, they understood these stakes. They weren't surprised when the authorities responded. That was the cost of confronting power directly. Now, supporters of modern protest tactics would argue that things have simply changed. They would say that the real battleground today isn't just physical confrontation. The true battleground is holding the public's attention. If an issue doesn't break through the noise of social media and the news cycle, it's very difficult to generate political pressure and thus get legislation changed in your favour. And from that perspective, dramatic protests are designed to force issues into the public conversation. Groups like Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion openly say that disruption and spectacle are part of the strategy. If people are talking about climate change, they argue, then the protest has already succeeded. And in many cases, that has some validity. These protests do indeed generate enormous media attention when they happen. Critics of this method of activism, of course, see it very differently to what the activists themselves think. One major criticism is that many modern protests target the public rather than the institutions responsible for the problems they're so enraged about. Blocking traffic does not affect oil companies. Throwing soup at paintings does not shut down fossil fuel extraction. All it does is generate headlines. And then, of course, another criticism of this is that many of these protests feel deliberately theatrical. They're designed to create dramatic images and viral clips rather than directly interfering with the activity being opposed. And critics argue that this can actually backfire by alienating the public that they're trying to win the hearts of. But there's even another way to look at this shift that's less about morality and more about incentives. Activism today operates in a totally different environment to the grassroots movements of last century. Many campaigns are organised through large advocacy organisations and, of course, NGOs, which you would know as non-government organisations. Now, groups like Greenpeace helped pioneer this model decades ago, and today many movements operate in a similar ecosystem. These organisations have staff, budgets, and fundraising operations. They need supporters, they need donations, and to achieve that, they need as much public visibility as possible. One of the most effective ways to generate that visibility is, of course, through dramatic protests that attract media coverage. In other words, the attention itself becomes one of their primary resources. A protest that goes viral can bring new supporters, new donations, and of course, huge media exposure. That doesn't mean that activists don't believe in the cause, especially those on the front lines. But it does mean that the system rewards actions that generate as much attention as possible. And when the attention becomes the main currency, activism can start to look more like a performance. Another thing that of course has changed is the role of social media in all of this. Today, a protest can become global within minutes instead of days or sometimes even weeks. This, of course, creates an incentive to produce images and moments that will spread online by going viral. In the past, activism tried to stop the thing that is opposed, but today it tries to capture attention around the issue instead. Now, this shift can have some unforeseen consequences. A lot of modern activism feels far less like confronting power and more just performing outrage for attention. You often see protesters shouting at police while filming the interaction on their phones. But when they actually cross the legal line and get arrested, the reaction is often outrage and claims of victimhood instead. Now, historically, these activists understood that arrests were part of the price of protesting. They didn't treat it as evidence that the system was illegitimate, especially when they did actions that broke the law. If you want to see what high-risk activism truly looks like today, you need to look at a place like Iran. People there protest knowing that they could be imprisoned or far, far worse. That's what it looks like when people actually confront an authoritarian regime head on. By comparison, many protests in Western democracies happen in environments where the risks are relatively low. People can loudly accuse the government of fascism while live streaming the protest on their phones for the world to see. And the fact that they're able to do that is actually evidence that the system they're criticizing isn't particularly authoritarian at all. Activism has always evolved with the media and political environment of the time. Civil rights activists understood the power of television. Environmental activists used dramatic confrontations that would make the evening news. Today's activists operated in a world dominated by social media and viral content, and that environment rewards visibility. But there is a big difference between raising awareness and confronting power directly. The activists who change history usually put themselves in front of something powerful: police, governments, corporations. Today, a lot of activism seems to be more interested in putting itself in front of a camera.